Thank you for watching Ahmed Shakil 5858. I am Ahmed Budnan. Following are the world news by American, European, and Canadian channels. African, Asian channels and all news agencies have reported the same news. Now the headlines. Justice Department and 16 states have sued Apple for maintaining monopoly in America. House Speaker tried to maintain his majority intact in Congress. A Congresswoman and non-viable pregnancy. Anthony Blinken is in Egypt for Gaza war. Israeli claim of killing 140 Palestinians near Al-Shifa hospital. Ukraine received barrage of missiles from Russia. No casualty reported. European Union frozen all Russian assets. Police officers receive sentences from the court. High school is a death investigation. Mr. Biden and his students' loan. Now the news in detail.
Good evening, I'm Amna Navaz. Jeff Bennett is away. On the NewsHour tonight, the Justice Department and 16 state attorneys general sue Apple for maintaining a monopoly. With a vote to avoid a government shutdown set for tomorrow, House Speaker Mike Johnson works to keep his fractious majority intact. And an Arizona lawmaker talks about why she publicly announced her decision to terminate a non-viable pregnancy.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
Actually, you don't need vision to do most things in life. It's exciting to be part of a team driving the technology forward. I think that's the most rewarding thing. People who know BDO.
A law partner rediscovers her grandmother's artistry and creates a trust to keep the craft alive. A Raymond James financial advisor gets to know you, your passions, and the way you enrich your community. Life well planned.
The Candida Fund, committed to advancing restorative justice and meaningful work through investments in transformative leaders and ideas. More at candidafund.org. Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. The Department of Justice and more than a dozen states sued Apple today in a landmark antitrust case. They argue that the tech giant has created an illegal monopoly in the smartphone market by using excessively restrictive hardware and apps that keep customers locked into Apple's ecosystem and that puts a, quote, chokehold on competition. That includes its payment and messaging systems and basic connections with other apps. Doha Mekki is the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the department, and she joins me now. Welcome to the NewsHour.
Hi, Amna. It's nice to be with you.
So the Department of Justice is arguing here that Apple's monopoly comes at the expense of developers, of rival phone makers, and also consumers. Tell us more about that. How specifically are consumers being harmed?
Sure. So today's lawsuit was filed about alleged monopolization, monopoly maintenance to be specific, by Apple, that we allege has artificially thwarted competition in the smartphone market. And specifically, we allege that Apple imposed restrictions on apps, products, and services that threaten to disrupt Apple's smartphone monopoly. And so consumers really suffer the consequences of that. Sometimes that looks like higher prices for smartphones, including the iPhone. It looks like disrupted innovation by potential developers that harms the entire ecosystem for smartphones. And it also means that Apple is thwarting technologies and emerging paradigms that may make consumers device agnostic altogether.
So part of Apple's response, as I'm sure you've seen, says the lawsuit threatens what they call the principles that set them apart in the market. Here's part of their response now. They say, if successful, this lawsuit would hinder our ability to create the kind of technology people expect from Apple, where hardware, software, and services intersect. Doha, as you know, part of the Apple appeal, what makes them so popular, is that they have this integration across this suite of systems and apps. Everything just kind of works together. Is there a sense here that DOJ is punishing them for what customers like them best for?
Absolutely not. The United States is in favor of consumer electronics and products and services that work for consumers, and competition is the best way to make sure that there is ample opportunity in the market for different kinds of providers to offer more of what consumers want. The United States government in its lawsuit is also very in favor of privacy and security, and specifically none of the conduct that we challenge in our lawsuit is necessary to ensure privacy and security.
So part of the DOJ's challenge here is to prove that the benefits Apple delivers to consumers don't outweigh its alleged antitrust practices, right? How do you do that?
So, there will be many months of discovery and a long road to trial in this case, which we very much look forward to. And one of the things that we will focus on is really developing a full record ahead of trial about all of the ways that Apple undertakes anti-competitive and exclusionary conduct. And obviously, Apple will have an opportunity to put forward any alleged justifications for its conduct. And it's our burden to show that the exclusions and restrictions that they deployed in their app store through developer guidelines, et cetera, outweigh what's required to deliver their products and services.
So if the lawsuit's successful, what kind of changes could DOJ be looking Apple to make? Could you be looking at structural changes, for example, breaking the company up?
So that's really a legal question. Our burden right now is to demonstrate an antitrust violation. And it is black letter law in the United States that a remedy really has to be tailored to redress the violation and prevent its recurrence. And so it's too early right now to say what the precise contours of a remedy are, but it is the role that the tradition and longstanding goal of the Justice Department to take on monopolies and pry open markets that have been encumbered by abuse of monopoly power and make sure that the forces of competition can take hold so that we are protecting the opportunity for next generation technologies and disruptive services and products that Americans have always looked forward to. It's about making sure that the next generation of Apples are allowed to take hold.
This lawsuit does follow years of regulatory scrutiny of Apple. We know they've already fought off a number of other antitrust challenges. What prevented the DOJ from taking action sooner? Action that might have saved some of the consumers it says were now harmed.
This lawsuit was actually filed after a methodical, careful, and very deliberate investigation. As you know, we take our cases and our facts as we find them, and we only file lawsuits when we are confident that we have real competition concerns that can't be addressed short of going to court. And so that's what happened here. And so there's no doubt justice delayed is justice denied, and we'll be excited to try our case just as soon as it's ready.
That is Doha Mekki, Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
In the day's other headlines, the quest to end the grinding war in Gaza took Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Egypt on his latest Middle East mission. Blinken met in Cairo with President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and later with his Arab counterparts, and he voiced hope about mediated talks in Qatar between Israel and Hamas.
Negotiators continue to work. The gaps are narrowing, and we're continuing to push for an agreement in Doha. There's still difficult work to get there, but I continue to believe it's possible.
Meanwhile, in Gaza City, smoke billowed from a fourth day of fighting around the Al-Shifa hospital complex. The Israeli military said it's killed more than 140 Palestinian gunmen there. Ukraine's capital city has suffered its heaviest barrage of Russian missiles in weeks. Military officials say all 31 of the missiles were shot down. Still, falling debris caused extensive damage to residential buildings. In all, 13 people were injured in the attacks, including a child. The European Union today formally took up the question of using frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine's military. The interest on those assets could provide more than $3 billion a year. EU leaders met in Brussels, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was among those endorsing the plan, despite Russian warnings that it amounts to theft.
I am quite sure that we are sending a very clear signal to Putin here. He has made a miscalculation if he believes that we are not able to support Ukraine for as long as it is necessary. And the use of windfall profits is a small but important component.
The European move came as $60 billion in American aid for Ukraine is still tied up in Congress. Back in this country, sentencing concluded today for 6 white former law enforcement officers who tortured 2 black men in Mississippi. The final pair received federal prison terms of 27 years and 10 years. The 6 defendants admitted to torturing Michael Jenkins and Eddie Parker after breaking into a home without a warrant in 2023. The Biden administration has announced it's forgiving a new round of federal student loan debt. The announcement affects 78,000 teachers, nurses, firefighters, and other workers in public service jobs. It cancels nearly $5.8 billion in student loans that they still owed. That makes nearly $144 billion in federal student debt forgiven so far by the administration. And on Wall Street, computer chip makers led the way, and major indices finished at record highs again. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 269 points to close at 39,781. The Nasdaq rose 32 points. The S&P 500 added 17. And a passing of note. Richard Higgins, one of the last survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack, has died in Bend, Oregon. He was a U.S. Navy radio man when Japanese planes attacked on December 7th of 1941. In later life, he became an engineer. Richard Higgins was 102 years old. It's believed that about 24 other Pearl Harbor survivors are still living. Still to come on the News Hour, why suicide rates are higher among tank units than the rest of the Army. Californians approve a plan to address homelessness and mental health. The life-threatening risks associated with eviction. And Dartmouth basketball players push the boundaries on unionizing college athletes.
This is the PBS News Hour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Congress is on the verge of passing a large spending deal 6 months into its fiscal year and with less than 48 hours left before a partial government shutdown. Lisa Desjardins has more on what has made this Congress one of history's most dysfunctional. Lisa?
Right, that dysfunction is one of the defining characteristics of this House of Representatives. We have a narrow Republican majority that has made governing unpredictable and at times impossible. The basement of the U.S. Capitol is a messy place of power. A lawmaking is also at stake for Republicans.
The world is watching. Lisa Desjardins, thanks as always.
Welcome.
The patchwork landscape of abortion restrictions in a post-Roe America can be both confusing and dangerous. This is true even for some lawmakers, one of whom took to the floor of the Arizona State Senate to describe her own recent experience with a non-viable pregnancy.
After numerous ultrasounds and blood draws, we have determined that my pregnancy is once again not progressing and is not viable. And once again, I have scheduled an appointment to terminate my pregnancy.
I don't think much for your time. Alarming suicide rates among the military and veterans can be traced to the stress and trauma from the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But those conflicts are over, and suicides remain at what the Pentagon calls an unacceptably high level. As Nick Schifrin details, a new report reveals that within the Army, Armor Brigade combat teams, which revolve around tanks, have the highest suicide rates.
Since 9/11, more than 30,000 active duty service members or veterans of the post-9/11 wars.
California voters have narrowly passed a ballot measure that will fund billions of dollars to help the state tackle its homelessness crisis. William Brangham looks at the initiative that just passed by a razor-thin margin.
About a third of the people who are homeless in America live in California, and for years it has been an endlessly vexing problem for the state, since many of these people also...
With pandemic protections like eviction moratoriums and emergency rent assistance drying up, eviction filings have risen more than 50% in some cities. And new research shows that housing instability can have deadly consequences. Stephanie Tsai has that story.
As the cost of housing in the U.S. continues to soar, new research shows a link between eviction and premature death, a link shown to be even stronger during the pandemic. During the first 2 years of the COVID-19 crisis, the mortality rate was more than twice as high for renters facing eviction. We spoke to renters across the country who have faced eviction about the toll housing instability took on their health.
My name is Sabrina Davis.
Have been going through during the pandemic, for example.
That, today, as rent burdens hit record highs, and
said it would not enter into a collective bargaining unit with the team. It's a conversation around athletes' effort.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Housing policies, but also as critical health policies.
Nick Gretz from Princeton's Eviction Lab. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
March Madness is officially underway, but underlying the excitement of brackets and potential upsets is a conversation around athletes' efforts to unionize. Last month, the Dartmouth men's basketball team voted 13-2 to form a union after the National Labor Relations Board ruled that the players were employees of the private university. But this week, the Ivy League's board said it would not enter into a collective bargaining unit with the team, saying adamantly that they are not university employees. John Yang explores what could happen next.
This is the latest challenge to the student-athlete model that has defined college sports for so long.
The U.S. Army estimates that the Ghost Army's work saved the lives of up to 30,000 American servicemen. And that is the News Hour for tonight. I'm Amna Navaz. On behalf of the entire News Hour team, thank you for joining us.
Shaped by the lives of those who live there.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
The US piles pressure on Israel to agree a ceasefire deal with Hamas. It's called for a UN resolution this Friday to order an immediate truce, while top diplomat Antony Blinken is heading for Tel Aviv following talks with Arab diplomats. The European Union pushes ahead with a plan to turn Russia's own money against itself. Interest from frozen assets would go towards helping to arm Ukraine. And the fugitive Catalan chief Carlos Puigdemont announces his bid to return as head of the Spanish region. He spent the past 6 years in self-imposed exile after orchestrating an illegal independence referendum. Welcome to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Alexander Orkot. And beginning in Gaza, Israel is continuing its raid on the only partially working health facility in the north of the territory, Al-Shifa Hospital. An Israeli military spokesperson said the operation will last a few days more as Hamas and Islamic Jihad gunmen are hiding within the complex. Hamas denies this, saying those killed have been patients and displaced people. Well, amid the fighting, concerns are also growing for the fate of the population as a whole, which has been starved of aid. France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent joined us earlier from the border near the north of the territory, where she witnessed trucks entering.
We're just a few meters away from the border with the Gaza Strip, and behind me are trucks carrying humanitarian aid, food destined for the north of Gaza, where a few 100,000 people are still living desperately in need of food. International aid agencies have been warning now for weeks about acute food insecurity and now the risk of famine. And so they've been asking for another passage point where trucks can cross through directly to the north. Tonight, the Israeli authorities have opened up this new passage point, and so you see these trucks waiting to go through. They've come from Kerem Shalom, further south, to the border with Egypt, and they will now be heading through. They're destined to get through to the people who need it in the north of the Gaza Strip. Israel has said here tonight they have no intention of starving the people of Gaza, but aid agencies have been sounding the alert, saying there is just not enough to eat for the people living in very dire, precarious positions in the north of the Gaza Strip. And in fact, the provision of humanitarian aid to them is one of the points that's being brought up at truce talks, which are taking place in Doha.
And during his 6th urgent Middle East mission, Antony Blinken met with senior figures from several Arab nations in Cairo on Thursday, discussing a potential ceasefire and the future of the enclave. The US Secretary of State will next be heading to Tel Aviv.
Progress is being made, assured Antony Blinken on the latest stop in his tour of the Middle East. The US Secretary of State held talks with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in Cairo, before joining ministers from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan and the UAE. His main aim, to advance ceasefire talks, as well as increasing humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza.
We've been working, as you know, with Egypt, with Qatar, and with Israel to put a strong proposal on the table. Hamas responded to that. Negotiators continue to work. The gaps are narrowing.
Blinken's trip comes amid growing disagreements between the US and its ally Israel, particularly over Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's intent to launch a major military operation in Rafah in southern Gaza, where more than 1 million Palestinians have sought refuge from ground strikes in the north. Meanwhile, ceasefire talks between Israeli officials and Hamas leaders, which had resumed in Qatar in recent days, have stalled again. A Hamas official in Lebanon saying that an agreement is far from being reached.
The occupation's response was generally negative and does not respond to the aspirations of our people and their resistance.
Blinken will head to Israel on Friday to meet with Netanyahu and his war cabinet to wrap up his 6th tour of the Middle East since war began last October.
Well, the US is meanwhile asking the UN Security Council to back a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire and hostage releases, increasing pressure on its ally Israel to allow humanitarian aid into the enclave and protect civilians. And New York correspondent Jessica Missouri has more.
The UN Security Council members are meeting behind closed doors to discuss this US draft resolution on Gaza that's been circulated. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said the resolution calls for an immediate ceasefire tied to the release of hostages. Yet it's not that simple. The resolution is not a straight-up call for a ceasefire. It says the Security Council determines the imperative of a ceasefire, but links that to the release of all the hostages. Now, France has made it clear that whilst the release of hostages is desired, this link between a ceasefire and the release of hostages is problematic. Because if the approach is to say no to a ceasefire until all the hostages are released, then that could lead to an even higher death toll in the Gaza Strip. There is a strong possibility that Russia would veto this US resolution if it comes to a vote either later today or more possibly on Friday. The US wants to avoid that. Many council members are also concerned that the language on Rafah is too weak in this resolution, that it leaves the door open for an Israeli assault. The other two resolutions that are in the pipeline are a short one that is drafted by the E10, the non-permanent Security Council members, which calls for a ceasefire during the Ramadan period and does not hinge the call on the release of hostages. And there's another which is being worked on by the French. This third resolution hasn't yet been circulated, but the text would aim to build on the E10 one to extend a ceasefire permanently and then lay the path for the reconstruction of Gaza and a political way forward.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has again called on the West to deliver air defense systems following an uptick in Russian airstrikes, while a $60 billion US aid package has been held up for months amid infighting by lawmakers in Congress. EU leaders have agreed to forge ahead with a plan to use interest from seized Russian assets to help arm Ukraine. Alman Georgian gives us the latest from Brussels.
The European Council has welcomed the Ukraine assistance facility worth €5 billion, but it's actually not quite as grand as it sounds because it is partly a repackaging of previous commitments. There's also a call, though, to work on an 8th package of support for Ukraine under the EPF, or European Peace Facility. There's a discussion that's still being had on the use of frozen Russian assets. No breakthrough here at the EU summit on that. It's clear that any profits on those frozen assets will not go to weapons purchases specifically, mainly because of Hungarian objections, but also partly because of the neutrality, the military neutrality of certain EU member states. Then on the whole security and defence conclusions of the summit, the EU Council welcomed the Czech Republic's urgent search for ammunition for Ukraine in warehouses wherever it can find them. Longer term, the EU is now looking to increase the effectiveness of its defence sector, to unlock both public and private financing for defence spending, and also inviting the European Investment Bank to look at how it can help with this entire war effort.
Now, France's Senate has overwhelmingly voted against a free trade agreement between the EU and Canada, thanks to an unusual alliance in the upper house between the left and right-wing opponents of French President Macron. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, initially agreed in 2017, has been heavily criticised by farmers in particular, who say it leads to unfair competition.
Outside the Senate, farmers and unions, few but determined, all denouncing CETA. At the same time, massive rejection in the Senate. CETA, that aims for free trade between Canada and the European Union, lowers customs duties by 98%. Applied provisionally for 7 years, but debated for the first time in the Senate by the initiative of the Communists.
An agreement which creates unfair competition for our farmers, as the mere clauses, despite your lies, are not included in the 2,344 pages of the agreement.
Rejected by the left, but also the Republicans.
We want free trade, but you know very well that this is damaging our farmers.
The executive has tried to camouflage the damage by noting CETA is responsible for an increase of 33% of French exports. So what is the future of this agreement? The government is grouping to resend it to the House of Representatives, who voted for it in 2019.
We need to supply the needed debate to provide concrete details so when the moment comes, the National Assembly can ratify the agreement.
But there's no date confirmed. The Communists said they'll put it to the National Assembly on the 30th of May. If the Senate and the National Assembly reject CETA, the government can notify it to the European Union, and it will cease to operate. If, on the other hand, it isn't notified to the EU, CETA could continue to operate. Touchy subject for Europeans.
Catalan separatist leader Carles Puigdemont has announced he'll run in Catalonia's snap elections this May. He spent the past 6 years in self-imposed exile in Belgium after Madrid issued an arrest warrant for him following an illegal 2017 independence referendum. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, though, pushed to pardon all the separatists as he needs their support to form a coalition.
To chance of president, Catalan separatist leader Carles Puigdemont takes centre stage. His last stint holding the region's top job ended with him fleeing to Belgium following a failed bid for independence in 2017. But that isn't stopping him from throwing his hat in the ring once again.
After spending 6 years defending the Catalan presidency in exile, now we have the opportunity to secure the restitution of the presidency unjustly, illicitly, and illegally dismissed by Article 155. That is why I have decided to present myself in the next Catalan elections for the Parliament of Catalonia.
Puigdemont is still a wanted man in Spain. After organising an illegal referendum to make Catalonia independent, he was arrested along with other separatist leaders before starting a life in exile. A controversial amnesty bill recently passed by Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's government could give him a chance to return home without arrest. The pardon won't come into force before the May 12th election. In the meantime, Puigdemont, who's a member of the European Parliament, will have to campaign from Belgium. He says he's ready to finish the job in Catalonia.
Let it be clear that this is my priority, to add maximum effort to successfully complete the independence process that we started in October 2017.
Sanchez says Puigdemont's announcement won't dent the Socialist Party's hopes of introducing a so-called new scenario in Catalonia. It's unclear whether the separatist leader will be successful in his presidential bid. The Socialists are currently leading the polls to take over the leadership of Catalonia, while Puigdemont's Junts party is trailing behind in second and sometimes third place.
Finally, Senegal's on-again, off-again presidential election is finally going ahead this Sunday after a campaign period of less than 2 weeks. The West African nation seen as a pillar of stability in the region, but the latest events have created unusually high tensions during the vote.
17 candidates are running for the presidency, but 2 men are stealing the limelight. Bassirou Diomaye Faye is the protege of Macky Sall's prominent rival, Ousmane Sonko. If elected Senegal's 5th president, Diomaye has promised to create regional economic hubs and develop national sovereignty by boosting homegrown industry.
We trust Diomaye. He will help us so that young people stop crossing the sea to live abroad. What they're looking for there, we have here. Senegal is rich, but we don't have good leadership.
Diomaye also plans to review the contracts signed with private companies, poised to start exploiting Senegal's oil and gas reserves later this year, while Amadou Ba, groomed to replace Macky Sall, was prime minister until earlier this month and enjoys the status of continuity candidate.
Amadou Ba represents stability. Amadou Ba is the former Prime Minister of Senegal. He's a statesman. Amadou Ba was the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Senegal. Amadou Ba was the former Minister of Economy and Finance of Senegal, so he knows the state. That's why we're choosing Amadou Ba as the candidate to succeed President Macky Sall.
But while Macky Sall's legacy includes the development of regional train networks and electric buses, he also drew weeks of mass protests after he announced the postponement of presidential elections, something many saw as a stunt to prolong his term in office. Campaigning ends at midnight on Saturday, and the 7 million Senegalese voters will make their choice on Sunday.
That's where we end this edition. Stay tuned for more world news on France 24.
On this Thursday night, Ottawa's proposed changes to investigating sexual misconduct in the military. The move survivors and advocates have long called for.
It's a good step in the right direction.
And why the legislation has its limits. Pleas for peace and to protect civilians in Gaza.
Israel has the right to defend, not to revenge.
The fresh confidence a ceasefire can be reached. Bad apple, the U.S. Justice Department's new lawsuit and accusations against the tech giant. And an apology nearly 7 decades in the making.
This was a failure of the system.
Manitoba's mea culpa to 2 men switched at birth.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Jackson Prosco.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Major reforms could be coming to the Canadian military's justice system. The federal government has proposed long-awaited legislation that will strip the Canadian Armed Forces of its ability to investigate and prosecute sexual offenses on home soil. Those cases would instead be handled by civilian courts, something advocates and survivors have called for. As Abigail Beeman reports, the changes come after years of recommendations and extensive investigative reporting by Global News.
It's change advocates call years in the making.
It gives more agency to the survivor because they no longer have to go through their commanding officer.
That's the biggest reform for survivors of military sexual misconduct. If the new legislation becomes law, they can go right to police with a complaint rather than through their chain of command. It was a key recommendation and one of many from separate reports by 2 former Supreme Court justices.
This is the right thing to do for men and women who serve in the Canadian Armed Forces. We've heard very clearly from victims and survivors.
Once the legislation is passed, there will be no fight over jurisdiction because it would be entrenched. So it's a good step in the right direction.
Beginning in 2021, Global News has reported extensively on allegations of sexual misconduct against senior military members. The government promised culture change and has been criticized for being slow to act.
Cultural change is critically important. We're absolutely committed to it, but I also recognize it's a process, not an event.
But Thursday's announcement still leaves some issues unaddressed. It only applies to alleged offenses in Canada, with hundreds of Canadian Armed Forces members serving abroad. And it's also no secret our civilian justice system is strained, and there's no promise of new resources, beyond the minister saying he's working with provincial counterparts.
It does seem like a major gap, and I will be pushing on the government to look at that as well.
The minister says the new legislation tackles 9 of the recommendations from the former Supreme Court justices, but after several years, he acknowledges there's still much more work to do, with 119 of the 206 recommendations expected to be completed by the end of this year. Jackson?
Abigail Beeman in Ottawa, thanks. Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre ramped up his campaign to try and pause a scheduled hike of the federal carbon tax on April 1st. After running petitions and attempting to force an emergency debate in the House of Commons, today he urged MPs to back his motion to topple the Liberal government over the planned increase. Our chief political correspondent David Aiken watched the debate play out. David?
Well, Jackson, the Conservatives simply did not have the numbers to bring down the government.
I declare the motion defeated.
The minority Trudeau government won the day with the support of Bloc Québécois and NDP MPs. The Tories would surely have known they would lose, but for them, the point of the exercise was to force the debate.
We as common sense conservatives are ready to restore hope in this country, but it starts with change. We rise today to vote non-confidence in this NDP Liberal government.
And while the House of Commons spent the day debating that confidence motion, Conservatives on the House's Transport Committee were trying to make more political hay at the expense of Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault. Guilbeault had been quoted in February saying the federal government would no longer invest in new roads. He subsequently corrected himself to say he meant there would be no federal money for a car tunnel in Quebec. But his political opponents were not going to let him off that easy.
So there seems to be a war on cars. This has been the plan all along. And so what Minister Guilbeault did was just say the quiet part out loud.
My comments were specifically related to the project in Quebec.
Guilbeault is a favorite target of Conservatives because he is the chief evangelist for the carbon tax.
So if you don't understand how the carbon tax affects road infrastructure, I can't help you, but I have a question for you. Is there anything that you would do to walk back, you personally, would you walk back, in any case, the 23% carbon tax increase in April?
Guilbeault would only defend the carbon tax in French, noting that, yes, while the carbon tax does go up April 1st, so does the rebate paid to most Canadians in getting Canada to net zero emissions. But the Institute said industrial carbon pricing systems on large emitters, that's what's in place in Alberta, will make the single biggest contribution to cutting emissions. Jackson.
Thanks, David. For the first time, Canada is setting targets for the number of temporary resident arrivals. The immigration minister says in 2023, Canada was home to about 2.5 million temporary residents, roughly 6% of the population. The federal government wants to reduce that to 5% by 2027. The reduction includes temporary foreign workers, but won't apply to the construction or healthcare sectors. It was back to business for the Liberal government of Newfoundland and Labrador today, releasing the provincial budget a day after delaying it due to a rowdy protest. A group of fish harvesters returned to the legislature demanding changes to their industry. They were met by dozens of police officers. Heidi Petrocek reports on the fallout from the dispute that overshadowed Budget Day.
A firecracker signaled the start of a second day of protest. Frustrated fish harvesters back before dawn, facing police officers in riot gear outside the Confederation building.
This side, stay here.
A court injunction granted to the province was meant to prevent protesters from blocking entrances or harassing government employees, but tensions were still high, although calmer than Wednesday's chaos. Police and protesters clashed, mounted officers pushing their horses back into the crowd. The family of this man, injured in the fray, says 52-year-old fisher Richard Martin is waiting in a hospital hallway for surgery.
A police officer picked him up from behind and slammed him down on the curb, allegedly. So his hip bone is completely smashed in half.
Don't be baited into doing something.
With the line held outside, government politicians went ahead with the budget inside, but one side of the House remained empty after opposition politicians refused to enter the building, citing solidarity with fish harvesters.
The Premier and his Minister of Fisheries led people to conclude that they heard us and they're actually going to do something. And we find out that nothing was done.
The province has repeatedly said it is working on fish harvesters' concerns, but with the affordability crisis felt here as much as anywhere, many feel the financial future is bleak.
This fishery has changed dramatically in the last 30 years, and there's massive debts now that's being incurred, especially by those young harvesters starting out.
Get this hammered out, get it done, and we're going home.
The question is whether that will happen now. Heidi Petrocek, Global News, Halifax.
In Ukraine, at least 17 people were injured in and around Kyiv in an early morning Russian missile strike. Around 30 missiles were fired on the Ukrainian capital, the first strikes in 44 days. Ukraine says its air defense systems intercepted all the missiles. Injuries on the ground were mainly caused by falling debris. The assault renewed calls from Ukraine's president for more international aid and world unity. The U.S. Secretary of State says there's clear consensus for an immediate and sustained ceasefire in Gaza. Antony Blinken made those remarks on a tour of the Middle East as the U.S. circulates a draft UN resolution that calls for a humanitarian pause in exchange for the release of hostages. As Crystal Gamansing reports, European leaders are also increasing pressure on Israel to do more to help civilians.
European leaders managed to unite around protection for Ukrainians. Now leaders are looking for consensus on civilian lives in Gaza.
Israel has the right to defend, not to revenge.
The European Union foreign policy chief has aggressively and repeatedly called on Israel to do more to protect civilians and permit more aid to enter Gaza. America's top diplomat is meeting with Middle Eastern leaders, selling a draft ceasefire resolution it submitted to the United Nations Security Council. The U.S. vetoed 3 previous council resolutions. The difference this time seems to be the temporary ceasefire is linked to the return of hostages. More than 100 Israeli hostages are believed to be held in Gaza, captured following the deadly October 7th attacks orchestrated by Hamas. In an interview with an Arab network, Antony Blinken sounded confident a new temporary ceasefire would be achieved.
We worked very hard to put a strong proposal on the table. We did that. Hamas wouldn't accept it. They came back with other requests, other demands. The negotiators are working on that right now. But I believe it's very much doable.
Israel launched fresh ground and air assaults on Gaza Thursday. The Israeli government says a delegation will go to Doha Friday for talks, but author Guy Siv says peace will do little for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's career.
What we're seeing today is a Netanyahu who's in deep political trouble. He has lost a tremendous amount of support, so it is in his interest to continue this war.
In a national TV address Wednesday, the Israeli prime minister said he approved military plans to enter Rafah and told the American president the operation was happening. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
The U.S. Justice Department and 15 states have filed an antitrust lawsuit against Apple, accusing the company of illegally monopolizing the smartphone market.
We allege that Apple has employed a strategy that relies on exclusionary, anti-competitive conduct that hurts both consumers and developers. If left unchallenged, Apple will only continue to strengthen its smartphone monopoly.
The 88-page lawsuit accuses Apple of intending to keep consumers using their iPhones instead of switching to other devices. In a statement, Apple said the lawsuit could set a dangerous precedent and hinder its ability to make compelling consumer-friendly technology. Apple is the latest in a string of big tech companies to be sued by U.S. regulators, including Meta and Amazon. In a medical first, doctors in the U.S. have transplanted a genetically modified pig kidney into a living patient. 62-year-old Richard Slayman, who has end-stage renal disease, underwent the 4-hour operation last Saturday. He's been recovering well, and so far there are no signs of rejection. A tribute to Brian Mulrooney at his childhood home. Coming up, we visit the neighborhood where he grew up.
Hey YouTube family, GN subs. Umberto Gray, attorney at law here, practicing in sunny Southern California.
The family of Brian Mulrooney gathered privately around the late former Prime Minister, an emotional occasion as he lies in repose at Montreal's St. Patrick's Basilica. Mulrooney will remain there until his state funeral this Saturday. Among those who paid respects today, former Quebec Premier Lucien Bouchard, one of Mulrooney's former cabinet ministers and an old friend.
I think that someone like Brian Mulrooney leaves behind him hope for young people. Let them think about Brian Mulrooney, young guy from Baie-Comeau.
Mulrooney would often call himself the little guy from Baie-Comeau, his hometown along Quebec's North Shore. Our Mike Armstrong is there for a glimpse of Mulrooney's early life.
If you stand on this street corner in Baie-Comeau, you're basically in the middle of Brian Mulrooney's childhood. It is in every direction, especially that one. So let's start up the hill. When Ben and Irene Mulrooney brought their first son home from the hospital, they lived at 132 Champlain Street. Brian was their third child, but the first born in Baie-Comeau. They moved several years later further down the street. Most of Mulrooney's childhood was spent at 99 Champlain Street. If you peek in, you can see the current owner's small tribute. The Mulrooneys eventually moved again, and again it was just further down Champlain to 79. Now, down the hill is the hotel where a teenage Mulrooney had one of his first jobs, washing glasses in the bar. A little further, there's the post office, another early job. He was a sorter. Now, near the crest of the hill is the church where Mulrooney was baptized. St. Emily was where his mother went to mass every Sunday and where Brian served as an altar boy. It was also for a time his school, classes were in the basement, and there was the occasional bingo. In his memoirs, Mulrooney remembers winning a turkey and 4 pounds of butter, which he and his mother proudly carried home. Now, Mulrooney's last visit to his hometown was in 2019. It was a ceremony at St. Emily to unveil a bust in his honor. Mulrooney talked about his love affair with the town and how it shaped him.
I suppose that if there were a model for a growing Canada, it would have been Baie-Comeau, a small town with big dreams.
The bust unveiled on that day is now in front of City Hall, and as dignitaries from around the world go to Montreal for the state funeral to remember this man, people here will watch from afar, sort of. With the blessing of the Mulrooney family, the town of Baie-Comeau is going to be showing the funeral at St. Emily, up the hill. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Baie-Comeau, Quebec.
Switched at birth, ahead what led to a formal apology from Manitoba's premier. The province of Manitoba has formally apologized to two men switched at birth nearly 70 years ago. Edward Ambrose and Richard Bouvet were born in the same hospital on the same day in 1955. While they can't change the past, they hope today's apology is an important step forward. Marnie Blunt reports.
First, there was a warm, heartfelt welcome. Then came the words two Manitoba men have spent years waiting to hear.
I rise today to deliver an apology that has been a long time coming for actions that harm two children, two sets of parents, and two families across many generations.
An official apology from Manitoba's premier, nearly 70 years in the making, to two men switched at birth in 1955.
Ed and Richard are here today as two people wronged by the Manitoba government and the institutions they should have been able to trust.
Edward Ambrose and Richard Bouvet were born on June 28, 1955, at a hospital in the small rural community of Arborg, north of Winnipeg. They were sent home with each other's parents. Now the two say they feel gratitude and relief.
He came across as apologizing for all of Manitoba, and it meant it was good. I feel relieved. And I think he did, like I say, he did a fantastic job. I think he put everything at peace.
The discovery of the switch was made 2 years ago, thanks to at-home DNA testing kits, which led to a meeting that brought a range of emotions.
It's emotional for meeting someone who is you, but I am him.
Bouvet discovered he was Ukrainian and Jewish. He had been raised Métis, attended day school, and was taken from his family during the 60s scoop. Now, they're trying to find the good in what they can't change.
It's been emotional, but it's been happy, it's been positive. And no one is losing anything by this, but our family is just expanding and growing.
This is the third known case of babies being switched at birth in Manitoba. 2 other cases happened in 1975, both at the same hospital in Norway House in northern Manitoba. Jackson?
Marnie Blunt in Winnipeg, thanks. Next, how some famous friends are remembering the late Brian Mulrooney. Well, as Canadians pay their respects to Brian Mulrooney, some high-profile figures are sharing their own stories of the late Prime Minister, and one theme stands out in many of the tales. Eric Sorensen gives us insight into Brian Mulrooney, the crooner.
Even a hockey hero in his prime was starstruck.
We were so proud and so excited to go to 24 Sussex.
And Wayne Gretzky remembers another time, a music icon just as anxious before singing in front of Brian and Mila Mulrooney.
I said, how you doing? He goes, I'm so nervous. I said, nervous? You're Michael Bublé. He goes, the Prime Minister of Canada and his wife are here, Wayne. I'm very nervous.
Gretzky chatting with the former Prime Minister's son, Ben Mulrooney, one of several public figures telling personal stories for a special on Chorus Radio.
We thought this side of him was something worth sharing.
And if there was one side of Brian Mulrooney that kept coming up, it was this. Music and singing. Canadians remember the famous Shamrock Summit when Mulrooney crooned an Irish favorite with U.S. President Reagan. Well, it wasn't a one-off. President George W. Bush recalls a dinner with Mulrooney.
He popped up at the table when we were visiting up in Canada and started singing. I said, oh my God, what is this guy up to? And it was clear that he loved to sing, and frankly, I was amazed.
Another president, Bill Clinton, talking to Ben Mulrooney.
The older he got, the more he would sing.
He sang at the drop of a hat. Thank goodness he had a good voice. We'd all been miserable, because he would have sung anyway.
Brian Mulrooney loved to sing, officially and unofficially.
He referred to himself as a frustrated saloon singer. I think he wanted us to remember him at his most joyful. And that's when he was singing.
Late in life, Mulrooney audio recorded several songs just for his family.
These are mostly for the grandchildren. And I thought, Neela particularly thought, it would be nice for them.
One was Paper Doll.
I'm gonna buy a paper doll that I can call my own.
A favorite, too, of Michael Bublé, a close friend.
A doll that other fellas cannot steal.
They sang together the last time they spoke by video.
And when the camera panned back, I could see the whole family was there, surrounding him. And everyone was very emotional, and I was very emotional.
You never had to ask Brian Mulrooney twice to sing, here joining the choir honoring him in his hometown. With a microphone in hand, it's hard to know what Brian Mulrooney really preferred, to make a speech or sing a song.
And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And there will be a Chorus Radio Network special remembering Prime Minister Brian Mulrooney, a family tribute. It will be hosted by his son Ben Mulrooney on Saturday afternoon. And Donna Friesen will host live coverage of Brian Mulrooney's state funeral in Montreal Saturday morning, right here on Global. And that's Global National for this Thursday. I'm Jackson Frosco. Tonight's Your Canada is the Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal, where Brian Mulrooney's state funeral will be held on Saturday. Thanks for watching and have a great night.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Woodman. Have a good life.